Welcome to the online sermon for Sunday, March 15th. While we always record our sermon so that those who cannot be here in person can watch it later, rarely do we record a sermon in place of being here in person. But circumstances have created a unique situation for us, and I'm so glad that we have this ability so that we can at least be together in this way, and we can continue our study in the book of Exodus together. Before we get into that message, let me share just a couple of announcements with you. First of all, even though we're not together, we still want to know what's going on in your life. We want to hear about the prayer requests that you have, and you can submit a prayer request to us online. And there on the screen, you can see a screenshot there that shows how to do that. On the main page of our website, when you click on the resources link at the top, a drop-down menu will show you submit a prayer request. And when you click on that, it brings you to this page, and you can fill out the form and hit submit, and your prayer request will go to the prayer team and various folks who will be sure to pray for you, and we'll follow up with you as best as we can. Secondly, we want to continue in our practice and worship of giving. And we can't do that in person, but we can do that online. And for many of you, online giving is your normal mode of giving, so just go about your normal way of giving. For others, this may be a new practice and a new way of doing this. From anywhere on the website, when you look at the top, you'll see the giving link in the upper right corner. And when you click on that, it brings you to this page, the screen that you're seeing, and you've got a couple online options. Under the laptop-looking icon, you can click there to give through our giving portal. It's kind of like the concept of paying a bill. You enter in certain information, and it transfers the money. Or you can do like I do. I use the text-to-give option, where I just do a little bit of setup, and I text my giving amount to the church, and it's just super convenient, easy. I love doing the text-to-give. But those are both ways that we can continue our practice, continue our worship, of giving to the Lord, even though we can't be here in person. And so we encourage you to do both of those, to share prayer requests and to continue with giving. Now, event-wise, we want to make sure you remember that the parent-child dedication is scheduled for April 19th. And this is our way as a church to celebrate children and for families to make a commitment to raise those kids, to have every opportunity to know Jesus and to follow him in their lives. The dedication will happen on the 19th. There are 2 orientation meetings that happen before then. So right now, they're scheduled for March 29th and April 5th, and you would just go to one of those. And you can get information. You can sign up online at our website, and we'll go from there. Now, just in general, regarding future events, we cannot at this time forecast how many events or gatherings will be canceled for us as a church. And so before you show up to an event or to a gathering at Stafford Crossing, be sure to check our website and check your email. We will do our best to have any changes, any cancellations, clearly communicated front and center as early as possible so that you have the information you need. You know when to show up and what's going to be canceled and so forth. So before you show up, check the website, check your email, and we'll do our best to communicate that way. Now, let's move on to the book of Exodus. Some of you know that I grew up in Alabama, and Alabama is known for a great number of good things, right? Great southern hospitality, good college football, good barbecue, peanuts, right? Half of all of the peanuts grown in the U.S. are grown in Alabama. So you're welcome for that. And so there's some great things that come from Alabama. There's one other commodity that Alabama is known for, and it's what we call the good old boy. Now, the good old boy is usually a pretty good person, right? They've got great intentions. They're just not the sharpest tool in the shed. And the good old boy is prone to do some pretty crazy things. He is the one who will set up a ladder in an impossibly precarious way and think that that's safe to use. Right? He's also the one who thinks it's a good idea to stack a bunch of mattresses on the back of a pickup truck and then to lay on top of them to hold them down as they drive down the highway. I've actually seen that happen. And then the mattresses and the good old boy blew off. It was actually pretty terrible. But this is what they do. While some good old boys do live to a ripe old age, a lot of them do not. because of their craziness. And it may not be initially apparent, but the good old boy does serve several purposes in the social fabric. First of all, occasionally, a good old boy will come up with a good idea. Kind of like this guy, right? He said, I think I've got a better way of roasting hot dogs. Not just one or two at a time. If I get my leaf rake, I could do like 10 at a time. He's a genius. So they do come up with some pretty good ideas. Secondly, good old boys are a little bit like the canaries in the mine. Back in the mining days, and they may still do it today, I don't know, but they would keep canaries down in the mine, and if the air became toxic, the canary would die long before a person would die. And so if the canary drops dead, everyone evacuate out of the mine. It was an early warning system. And the good old boy is a good early warning system. You can let him go first and see if he survives, and if he does, how bad are his injuries? And then the rest of us, we can make a more educated decision about whether we want to follow that or maybe we want to go a different path. I have to admit, I've been the good old boy a time or two in my youth, but I think I have been the second person more often, watching the good old boy, and then we'll see how it goes, and then we'll determine what to do. Well, today, we're coming to part 2 in our series called Unfinished, as we are extending and going through our study in the book of Exodus. And we're calling this series Unfinished because even though we're coming to the end of Exodus, the story of God's work with the Israelite people is unfinished. It's not over. It is going to continue for centuries and centuries. Likewise, God's work in us and his transforming work in us is unfinished. We are works in progress. And so we're very much in the same place. The Israelites today get to play the role of the good old boy for us. We have the chance to see how things unfold for them and whether we want to follow their example or choose a different path. And as this drama unfolds, we're going to see that we must learn lessons from the Israelites' example so that we can experience more of God's presence, more of his power in our own lives. We want to see what happens, and we want to walk away with some don't do that, but do this lessons for us. And what is at stake is much more significant than singed eyebrows and a few permanent scars. Our experience of God's presence, our experience of his power will be determined by learning these lessons. And while they do apply to us individually, right, we can apply these lessons to our lives as an individual, I want us to think equally this morning about how they apply to us collectively as a church. What are the don't do that lessons, do this lessons that we need to learn as a church so that we avoid the pain that Israel felt and that we experience more of God's presence and more of his power in our midst? So let's start. Let's start with the don't do that side of the equation. What is it that we're supposed to avoid and why? Well, the what do we avoid? That's pretty clear. And we read about it, learned about it in chapter 32. And we saw that the Israelites veered off of God's path when they tried to follow him in their own way with the golden calf. Things got a little bit crazy as they attempted to worship God in their own way. Now, Pastor Darrell did a fabulous job teaching out of chapter 32 and then on this topic last week. And so we're not going to go into great detail on what happened there. If you missed that message, please feel free to watch it on our website or through our app to catch it. I do want to spend time this morning examining the tragic consequences of what they did in chapter 32 with the golden calf as they veered off of God's path. And the first consequence that they suffered was the loss of God's presence. They veered off of his path and they lost God's presence with them. Look at Exodus 33, verse 3. And here God is talking to Moses. He says, "Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you." Now, from the moment that the Israelites left Egypt, God's presence had gone with them. He had been with them, sometimes visible in a cloud, other times visible as a pillar of fire. Moses was their link for communication, but they knew his presence was there with them. His power was on display in their midst as food and water was supplied miraculously for them. The ground shook at his voice. Enemies were defeated in battle. All of this was made possible because their God was with them. And in the ancient world, the presence of your God was indispensable for life. You depended on the presence of your God for everything. And so God's pronouncement here that he would no longer go with them, no longer be with them, was a terrifying prospect for the Israelite people. Everything that they were confident of is now in doubt. Everything that God said he would do is now questionable because he's not going to be there with them. And because he would no longer be with his people, another consequence that they had to experience was being stuck with a cheap replacement. When you lose God's presence, you get stuck with cheap replacements. In verse 3, God had said he's not going to go with them, but he does not leave them completely alone. He sends a replacement. Look at verses 1 and 2 with me. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants." Verse 2, "I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites." Those were all the people that were living currently in the promised land. God would send an angel with them. Now, taken on its own, an angel's presence, that's a powerful blessing, right? To be led by an angel and to have that presence with you is nothing to scoff at unless that angel is a substitute, a replacement for the presence of God himself. Any angel, any number of angels, is a cheap replacement by definition when compared to the presence of God. Another cheap replacement that they experienced is detailed and talked about in verses 7 through 23. It's called the tent of meeting. Look at verse 7 with me. "Now Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp." Now God had gone into great detail with Moses in the preceding chapters regarding the construction of the tabernacle, right? The tabernacle was to be his place of residence, God's place of residence with his people. It was going to be set up in the center of the Israelite camp, and all the nation would be arranged around them, around the tabernacle. And this would be where God's presence would be. He would be at the center of their lives. But if he is not going with them any longer, this tabernacle is not really needed anymore. And so we have the tent of meeting that is set up where Moses could meet with God. Apparently, God had not completely abandoned them right away. His presence was still there, but it had begun to distance himself from the people. The tent was not in the middle of their camp. They were not arranged around it. God was not in their midst. He was some distance away, distancing himself. Again, on its own, this tent of meeting, that's a pretty cool deal. You know, but compared to God's presence, right in the midst, in the center of their lives, this tent of meeting is a cheap replacement. So what does this mean for us today? After all, we are not Israel. We live in a very different time of God's work, a different time in the history of mankind. For us, every follower of Jesus has God's Spirit in our hearts and in our minds. We carry his presence with us every day so that our bodies, our lives, serve the same purpose of the tabernacle and the temple. It's the place where God resides in this world. And that is true of us individually, but it is also true of us collectively as his church. As his church, we can have God's presence with us at work in our midst. And so both individually and collectively, and here's the lesson for us, we can forfeit the power and impact of God's presence with us. We like the verses where God says that he will never leave us or forsake us, right? Those verses make us feel safe, they make us feel good, and we celebrate that. But we make a mistake if we forget to connect those promises to the verses where God invites us to walk the narrow path with him. And this narrow path is defined by his commands. His command, he says, God says to us, come walk this narrow path with me, and I promise to never leave you, never forsake you on this path. The narrow path says that Stafford Crossing, our church, exists to help people trust and follow Jesus. Right? We are on God's path when we are introducing people to the saving God's saving grace through faith in Jesus. And we are on God's path when we are helping people grow and mature in their faith. When we are faithfully teaching God's truths, either here together on Sunday mornings or in our small groups, in Kids Crossing, in Fusion Student Ministry, anywhere that this happens. We're helping people mature in their faith as we connect with one another in Christian community, serving others so that we all experience God's life-changing power. This is the path that God has called us to. We are on God's path also when we're caring for the needy and the vulnerable in this world. When we consider what should our church be doing, we must be so careful that everything we do is on that narrow path that God has defined for us. You see, the Israelites veered off of God's path. And they worshiped him by their own means, and so they lost the presence of God with them. We too can veer off of God's path for us, individually, but also as a church. And we will forfeit the impact and the power of God's presence with us. May that never happen. But how do we avoid that? Remember, the good old boy occasionally comes up with some good ideas. Occasionally, he does something really well. And we've watched the Israelites crash and burn. We know, hey, don't do that. But we also can see what they did well. Ways that we can follow their footsteps. We want to do these things. These are the do this lessons for us. And the first thing that we should do, that we should adopt from the Israelites, is humbling ourselves before God. At least twice, we see a very humble attitude both in Moses and in the people at large. In Moses, we see the humility when he is confronted with God's presence in chapter 34. Look at verse 8 with me. Moses bowed to the ground at once and worshiped. The preceding verses tell us that God passed before Moses. He declared his name to Moses. He was revealing himself to Moses. And Moses' response is to immediately hit the ground and worship in complete surrender and subjugation to God. He's not standing there with his hands raised, soaking in the presence, saying, oh, this is the best moment of my life. No, in humility, he hits the dirt. In the nation at large, I think we see appropriate humility when they are confronted with their wrongdoing with the golden calf. Looking in Exodus 33, starting in verse 4. When the people heard these distressing words, right, that God was not going to go with them, they began to mourn, and no one put on any ornaments. For the Lord had said to Moses, tell the Israelites, you are a stiff-necked people. If I were to go with you for even a moment, I might destroy you. Now take off your ornaments, and I will decide what to do with you. Verse 6, so the Israelites stripped off their ornaments at Mount Horeb. Now, I'll give you a little regular person translation here. God says, you have made me really angry. Now take those ornaments off before I take them off for you and beat you with them, right? He was upset. He was angry with them. And the Israelites wisely, humbly do as God instructs. They express their emotions in mourning. That's not just, oh, we're really sad. This is a way of expressing great distress and grief. They were in mourning. And the wording in verse 6 indicates to us that they didn't just take their ornaments off for that day or that week, but this was a permanent change moving forward. They were turning a corner. They were going a new direction. They took their ornaments off at Mount Horeb, and they did not put them back on. They were going to stay on God's path. Folks, we must do this. We must humble ourselves before God. We must be people who surrender and submit to Him. And maybe that is a first-time decision for you, to humble yourself and to say that I know I have done wrong, I have sinned, as the Bible says, and I believe that Jesus paid the penalty for my sins, and I need God's forgiveness. And to express those things in prayer to Him, to say, God, will you forgive me for the sins, the wrong things I have done? And I believe that Jesus' death for me paid that price, and I want to live a new life. I want to surrender my life to you. Maybe that's your step of humbling yourself for the first time before God. For the rest of us, it is a daily process. It is a daily practice and exercise to humble ourselves before God, to acknowledge that He is God and we are not, to acknowledge that He has given us commands that we are to follow, to acknowledge His direction and leadership in our lives and to follow those promptings. We must humble ourselves before God, and we must be a church that has a healthy dose of humility before God in our DNA. That though we are His beloved children, we are also His humble servants, right? He is our commander-in-chief. He is our king. We exist for Him. In no way does He exist for us. Looking further into chapter 34, we see several directions that God gives to Israel. And these actions, these directions are equally applicable to us. And they are more do this lessons. These are things that we should be doing. First is to humble ourselves before God. Secondly, and this is simple, obey God's commands. Obey God's commands. Look at verse 11 out of chapter 34. God says, obey what I command you today. Do what I'm telling you to do, right? And this is such a common theme in God's interactions with humanity. He has a defined path, a way of living life defined by His commands. His invitation for mankind to be in a relationship with Him entails following those commands, to walk that narrow path. He says, narrow is the gate, and narrow is the path that leads to life. Now, in our last series, The Real God, we were reminded that God is only good, and God is completely holy and perfect. And so we know that His commands are only good for us. His commands are perfect, and we can trust that they are good commands for our lives. We don't get to pick and choose which ones we like, which ones we want to follow. God gives commands, and we follow them. The third do this lesson that we need to take from the Israelites here is to make no compromise with the world. No compromise with the world. Look at Exodus 34, verses 12 and then 15. He says, be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going, or they will be a snare among you. He's obviously talking to the Israelites here. But verse 15, be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land. He's repeating this. For when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to them, they will invite you, and you will eat their sacrifices. You will become a participant in worshiping their gods. Now, if only the Israelites had been true to this command, if only they had obeyed and followed this, they would have avoided so much pain. But they were not. They did make treaties with people in the land, and they did allow some of the occupants to remain there. And everything God said would happen, did happen. And Israel suffered greatly because of it. We must follow this command. We must not make compromises with the world. Now, we're not fighting to occupy a land, and we're really not fighting to create or maintain a, quote, Christian nation. We are called to help people trust and follow Jesus. That is our path. That is our purpose. And we cannot make compromises that will hinder that mission. Eternal lives hang in the balance. Our compromises look very similar, right? Even though we're dealing with different dynamics, different specifics, the generalities are the same. We're giving in to outside factors, compromising with outside factors, resulting in lowering God's priority in our lives. We're veering just 2 degrees off from God's path. We may not be dealing with, false religions and sacrifices and such. We compromise with more common things like our work and our hobbies. When we work so much extra hours, or we make time for that activity and that sport, but we don't have time for things of God anymore. Or we compromise with things like our creature comforts, when things like a rainy day keeps us from coming to church, or sleeping in prevents us from showing up to serve and to contribute to what's going on. We compromise with things like wanting nicer material goods so that we max out our budget for that newer car or that bigger house or that particular brand of clothes, whatever it may be. We max out our budget so we have no monies left, no resources left to give to God. Now, normally, a compromise is where 2 people meet in the middle, right? Both sides give a little and they get a little. They both get something that they want. But when we compromise spiritually with the world, we lose everything. We lose on all sides. We lose the power and presence of God in our lives. And then that thing, whatever it is that we've compromised for, turns out to be a cheap substitute, a knockoff of what we thought we were going to get. It leaves us unsatisfied. It leaves us unfulfilled and worse off than we were. Well, all these compromises leads to the last do this lesson from Israel. And it's simply to reject all idols. Reject all idols. Looking in Exodus 34, God says, break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles. Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Verse 16, and when you choose some of their daughters as wives for your sons, and those daughters prostitute themselves to their gods, they will lead your sons to do the same. Do not make any idols. I get the feeling here that God is making every effort to be crystal clear. You would think after the golden calf incident that the Israelites had learned their lesson, that God will not put up, He will not allow any worship of false gods, any distorted worship of Him. But they did not learn their lesson. God was not wasting His breath here. He knows the propensity of humanity to create and then bow down before idols. And the Israelites' history shows that they did exactly what God warned against here. All the compromises they made with the people in the land led to their worship of false idols. And all the compromises that we might make in our lives leads to the creation of idols in our lives. Those things that we compromise our commitment and dedication to God for, maybe it's success or enjoyment or preferences, those kind of things, they soon become idols that our lives bow down to. When that item, that success or that enjoyment or that desire becomes the first filter of our decision making, it has become an idol in our lives. When we begin to sacrifice for that thing, that success, that enjoyment, that preference, when we begin to sacrifice for that, rather than sacrificing that in service to God, it has become an idol for us. As a church, if we want political influence and activity, more than we want our gospel mission of helping people trust and follow Jesus, then we have an idol. If we want bigger crowds more than we want to faithfully teach God's word, we have an idol. If we were to want a large balance in the bank account more than we want to help those in need, then we have an idol. And we will be in the same place that the Israelites were in, having lost God's power, having lost his presence in our midst. Our God is a jealous God, meaning that he expects and demands what is rightly his. He demands all worship. He deserves all worship, complete, unfiltered, undivided. And that is what he expects. And if we choose to put an idol in his place, we will not have his presence and power with us. He will not abide that. Now, I know that you're just hearing this today, right? I've been thinking about this message and this topic for many weeks now, and I've been sick. I have been sick in my heart at the thought that this place, this church, could one day be in a place where we lose God's power and presence in our midst. That this building could one day be turned into a VFW hall or a wedding venue. Or maybe we just become a church in name only, lacking any presence and power of God in our midst. Folks, we cannot let that happen. That cannot be allowed to happen. Thankfully, all we have to do to avoid this, to prevent all of this, is to stay on the narrow path that God has called us to. All we have to do is not wander off, not veer off, to stay humble, to obey God's commands, make no compromises with the world, reject all idols. Will you make a personal commitment? A commitment to pray for your church daily, weekly. Pray for your church. Pray for the staff. Pray for the elders as decisions are being made, as ministries are being led, that we will not veer off, that we will follow these lessons of humility and obedience, no compromise, rejecting idols. When we stay with God, we experience all of his power, all of his presence in our midst. There is a unique lesson for us at the end of chapter 34, where we read that Moses had something strange happen as a result of his time spent in God's presence. It says that his face would glow, literally glow, and it was freaking everybody out. He had to wear a veil over his face. But he had been with God, and that time with him left a physical, undeniable imprint on Moses' life. It was undeniable that God's presence was with him. We need our lives to shine with the undeniable presence of God with us. We need our church to shine and to light up with the undeniable power of God in this community. Power to change hearts, power to change lives. We need this. We must not settle for anything less. These are some great, don't do that, do this lessons from the nation of Israel in Exodus. And I hope we take these to heart. I pray that we never experience the loss of God's power and presence, and we see more and more of his presence with us. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for these lessons, that we can look back on the nation of Israel and we can see what they did wrong, we can see what they did well, so that we can do the good things and avoid the negative things. God, help us to learn these lessons, to stay humble, to obey, to make no compromises, to reject all idols, so that we have your presence, your power at work in our midst. God, we are really no smarter and not that much better than the nation of Israel. We are prone to wander. Help us. Call out to us. Don't let us wander too far. Call us back to that narrow path that you have defined so that we can glorify your name and we can help many, many more trust and follow Jesus. Amen.